So today is my great honor to introduce our EMSL seminar speaker, Professor Andrea Grieshop, go for Andy. So I know Andy by last year, I hosted the EMSL information session at the Triple L. Andy was Triple L president at that time and the conference chair. Oh, okay. Yeah. Conference chair there. That's why he provided great support for me. And so, and Andy is a professor at the NC State University, and he graduated, got his doctor PhD degree from the Carnegie Mellon. And his research is focused on the source and the evolution of atmospheric aerosols, characterization of emission from mobile and stationary combustion source, and also link the air pollution emissions and the climate change, and also air pollution exposure assessment. So, and the technical policy analysis of the environmental impacts of the energy system and the energy and the environment in developing countries. So today he will give us a talk about his research related to the biomass burning, and let's welcome Andy. If you have a question during the presentation, you can put in the chat. Andy will answer your question at the end.
Yes, thank you. Thanks you all for being here, and especially thanks to Jay for setting up this visit and for inviting me. It's great honor and pleasure to be here. So as Jay said, I'm at North Carolina State University, and what I'm trying to do here is kind of give a bit of an overview of some research and related mostly to household biofuel use. It's probably a little bit different than what is a focus here. And part of my point is to sort of make the point that this is an important thing to think about, not only from what you might think, things like health and but also for understanding its impact on the Earth system. So just a little bit of background. I am from NC State University, Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm in a pretty large department of civil construction and environmental engineering. So I wanted to sort of emphasize that because I am an engineer, and so I'm very kind of problem focused. And my department is quite large and diverse, and I have about 25 people in the environmental area. And so one of the things I'm kind of looking forward to do is learning more about stuff at EMSL that might be relevant to others, folks that work on water quality, environmental transport, things like that. But this is where I work and and live. So just to give a little bit of broad background of my overall group, these are kind of, I think, the Venn diagram of things I work on. I mean, my training is in aerosol science. And as part of that, I've done things to develop some new techniques in it and deploy them. And a focus has always throughout my work been on combustion emissions. And so that includes things like what I'll be talking about today, household fires and biofuel use, also things like vehicles and other types of fires. And then one thing I like to do is try to bring different viewpoints together. So that is things like human health and climate and understanding maybe trade-offs or synergies related to these things. And then my group, this is a fairly recent picture of sort of recent alumni and current members. So I just want to be very clear that most of the work I'm presenting is done by other people. Right? So mostly I do experimental work. I've done a bunch of work on organic aerosol volatility and secondary organic aerosol. So those in the aerosol world, know these terms well. But a good amount of work also on field measurements. So I do have a smoke chamber, and I use an oxidation flow reactor, which I'll talk about a little bit. But a big focus in the last decade has been on household air pollution. And a lot of that is field work in international settings. So, and that ranges from everything from understanding emissions of different sources to also indoor air quality and personal exposure monitoring. And so there's a pretty strong sort of health aspect, which I know is not DOE's wheelhouse per se. So I tried to focus this talk more on things that are kind of more climate and Earth system related. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about some synthesis work that I've done. I also work on things like sensors. So a fairly broad variety of things. And hopefully, I'm not trying to cram too much into what will be hopefully a 45-minute talk. So just sort of what I want to cover, why I work on this area of cook stoves and why I'm discussing it here, where it may not seem super relevant. I'm going to talk briefly about field emissions that we've done sort of in the field of cook stoves used by folks in interventions. I'll talk about lab work that looks at especially aging of aerosol emissions from these types of sources. And then finally, some work that's ongoing with Lund University in Sweden that kind of hopefully that we'll be continuing to work on with folks here, looking kind of more fine-grained at combustion conditions. And one of the overall themes is that combustion conditions are an important thing that maybe isn't as recognized in understanding biomass burning emissions overall. So I'll come back to this, but basically, like I said, I want to make the point that household biofuel emissions, cook stoves are important. They're complicated because there's a social and a technical aspect, as well as the sort of interesting science, physical and chemical science questions. There's a lot of different combustion modes that are covered by this source class. Aging is important and is also a strong function of combustion type. And then kind of talk briefly about what field and lab experimentation can offer separately. Okay, so why am I focusing on this? If you've heard about cook stoves, mostly it's probably because of the global health impacts. So this is a map showing deaths per 100,000 people by country. These are large numbers. You can see are relatively large numbers. You can see that this is an issue in the global south, so in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa. If we think about that overall, we're looking at hundreds of thousands to millions of deaths in individual countries. And so just to put it in context, the most recent estimates, about 3 million premature mortalities due to this sort of source class per year in 2021, and that's related, on the same order as the overall mortality impact of air pollution globally. So it's a large impact, and I bring this up because this is kind of why I got into it as an environmental engineer. It's like this is a big source class. But when I started out, my big question was, how do the health impacts and the climate impacts of these activities and also efforts to address these activities, how do they correlate? Are they anti-correlated? So and part of the motivation for this was that this idea of carbon credits. So for cook stove programs that you can basically have people offset emissions here by paying folks in India to change their cook stove or change their fuel. Is that really going to have sort of synergistic effects? Is it going to have trade-offs that we're not aware of? And so this is like over a decade ago, I just sort of stumbled into this question. And what I ended up doing was looking at a lot of different ranges of, these are all different kinds of biomass cook stoves, also things like charcoal and gaseous fuels. And wanted to say, if we promote all these things, are we going to have the intended effects or not? And so what I came up with was a framework to sort of look at this trade-off. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the axes here, but just to kind of point out what I'm looking at is climate trade-offs. This is a very crude climate impact calculation, just looking at the species that are emitted and global warming potentials. And then a sort of health-related axis. And you can think about this as essentially emissions scaled to estimate human exposure and also the risk, the health risk that's associated with these emissions. But you can kind of think about the x-axis is PM emission and the y-axis is some estimate of climate. And so what I did is looked at all these different kinds of options of fuel and technologies to try to see how they fit in this overall space. And there are some, you can see that there's sort of a tendency towards the origin, meaning things that are cleaner in PM emissions or exposure tend to be lower in estimated climate impact as well. But there are also some cases that aren't sort of so clear. So for example, this point over here, and this isn't going to work. This point W, the red point on the right there is a traditional wood fuel stove. And a common transition in urbanizing low-income settings is to charcoal. And what you see is that that's associated with quite a significant reduction in PM emissions or exposures, but also an increase in the climate impacts. And that's largely because the process of making charcoal is very, very inefficient and associated with a lot of emissions. Likewise, someone transitioning from charcoal to a gasifier stove, which is this lower green point, would have and this would be one that you might expect to be funded by a, say, climate offset program, could have a great reduction in climate impact, but actually an increase in exposure because these might emit more particulate matter. And then from a climate offset standpoint, going from these traditional options on the right side, there's really a wide range of different options that have semi-equivalent climate impacts, but a really wide range of exposure benefits. So this was all just sort of synthesis analysis, and it wasn't really based on any measurements I did. And this is all based on lab results related to these stoves. So what I sort of followed up this with over the last decade is really trying to get more into the details of those emissions in the field. So understanding, so there are a variety of gases that are emitted by these sources and particles. So a lot of the focus has been on the particles, mostly PM 2.5 or fine particles, which are of course made up of black carbon, organic carbon, brown carbon. And so what we've done then is to just basically look at a lot of different, sorry, skipped a step. So kind of zooming way back out, I just want to make the point that all these tiny sources, I said little fires everywhere, in some make a huge contribution to the atmospheric system. So this is work by Aaron McDuffie and others, using the PNNL-based SEDS inventory to look at sort of sector result emissions. And there's a lot going on here, but you can see I have 4 different emission types. And I wanted to focus on the sort of baby blue, which is residential emissions. And you can see, without going into all the detail, that basically for non-methane VOCs, carbon monoxide, and these 2 different aerosol species, residential fuel is one of the largest or the largest contributor in the atmosphere of these. This does not include wildfires, but the wildfire contribution globally is on the order of the same as that blue stack in black carbon, for example. So these are still very large sources. And what that translates to is large effects on atmospheric PM. Again, we're not necessarily focusing on health here, but where there is PM, there are effects on the Earth system, right? So this is showing the contribution to ambient PM 2.5 by country. And this is also based on this SEDS, what's called the GBD Maps project. And you can see the bar on the bottom here goes up to 50%. So in a place like Nepal, that's saying roughly 50% of ambient annual average PM 2.5 in Nepal is coming from these tiny fires that are burning everywhere. And just to kind of put that in perspective, wrong way. This is agricultural burning. You can just see by the colors, the distribution is quite different, but if you look at the scale, this is up to 4%, whereas the last map was up to 50%, right? So there are definitely places where ag burning is a big contributor, but the range and the extent of these household fire contributions is very large. So if we look at this by region, this is unfortunately a little bit hard to read, but I just wanted to point out, this is the South Asia, Southeast Asia region. The estimate is around a quarter of ambient PM 2.5 over that whole region is due to these fires. So again, little fires, but very large impacts overall. And then if we think about climate, I wanted to sort of, I couldn't resist putting in a figure from this sort of synthesis study we did. And I'll talk about it in a minute, but there's been a shift in the mindset in this field to really emphasizing modern fuels. So that would be things like liquefied petroleum gas or propane or electricity because of some of the challenges I'm going to talk about. So what we did was did a sort of global assessment looking at what would happen if we very rapidly shifted to LPG, propane, or electricity. And I just wanted to extract one example of this just to show that this is, you know, a reasonably large effect. So this is a 20-year full transition from solid fuels to LPG. And what this is showing is the estimated global average temperature change. And it's broken down by the different species that are emitted by this activity. And so the net here over on the right tells what, you know, with our scenario of a switch to LPG, what the overall warming or cooling would be. And you can see it's cooling. And then what the star is showing is that basically in this 20-year period, something like 4% of the total business as usual warming is due to this sector. So if you compare that star to the little black line next to it, you can see that about a third of that would be reduced by transitioning to a fossil fuel, something like LPG, which is a little bit counterintuitive, especially for people working in this area. Obviously, this is global average. The regional effects are very different. We can't resolve that with the type of model that we used. And then obviously the other important thing to do, and maybe transition to the rest of my talk, is that the uncertainties are very large. So this is the cooling effect from averted emitted OC and the warming effect from black carbon rather. You can see the error bars on those are very large. So as we all know, aerosol climate effects are uncertain. So we can say our sort of median estimates is that these transitions would reduce warming, but you know the error bars are very large. Okay, so that gets into some of the field work we've done. And as I said, a big focus has been on going to various places around the world where people are trying to distribute different types of technologies or fuels and understanding how they perform. So I'm going to be focusing on emissions, but we've also looked at things like air quality and exposure as well. So a bunch of different students and postdocs have done this work over the last decade or so. And I just want to kind of summarize that very briefly. So this is the picture I showed you before. This is all based on laboratory data. So how we would expect these different types of sources to work. And what I'm just going to do is add what we've seen in the field. So, for example, in the first study that we did was a transition from a traditional open fire to what are called rocket stoves, which are kind of pretty simple biomass stoves. And sort of the closest analogy is this orange dot to the left here. And you can see that there's far less benefit from this. And what we found is relatively little benefit from this intervention, either from a health standpoint or a climate standpoint. And there's several reasons for that. So the next study was looking at this stove right here, which is a fan-driven forced draft gasifying stove that in the lab performs very well. And what we found is, you know, it's much further to the right than we expected or hoped. So underwhelming performance and a health study associated with this found no real benefit of its use. Next, we studied a similar type stove, but what that uses biomass pellets, and this was in Rwanda. And we actually found this performed quite well and actually quite close to modern fuels like LPG in terms of the PM emissions and anticipated climate effects. So that was kind of, this I would say is all bad news for interventions. This is good news. And we also have looked at things like LPG in the field and maybe would be expected. They perform pretty similarly in the lab and in the field. So overall, what we learned is that a lot of these biomass stoves don't work very well. There's a lot of different ways things don't work well. One is people just don't use them. So this is a picture from India showing a situation where people were given two stoves, and you can see they just shoved one into the back of their hearth area and used it as a pot holder. So not going to do much good there. Another is one of these gas fires. You can see there's all kinds of fuel sticking out because people have to process fuel heavily to use it in this type of stove, and they're not going to do that if they're busy. And even with the pellet stoves, if not operated correctly, they basically turn into kind of smoke generators. And so we looked at this in the lab, and a lot of this just has to do with not using it quite correctly. Like I said, what people have done in the sort of field is to really shift towards using modern fuels like that we use, like gas or electricity. But the reality is that this type of, biomass fuel use is going to be ubiquitous for a long time because transitioning to modern fuels in these very poor resource constrained settings is a huge effort. So a little bit more focus on what is in those emissions. And this is kind of one situation where we made use of samples that were collected in the field and focusing on brown carbon emissions. So this is a light absorbing fraction of organic carbon. And so what we do is take methanol extracts of the field samples, we look at them at UV-based spectrophotometry, and then compare that to what people have found from non-field samples. Because as I showed, what's happening in the field and what happens in labs is quite different. So, and this is work that my student Maxim Islam worked on. And just to give a bit of background, we define the optical properties based on a complex refractive index, and we're focusing on the light absorption component, which, brown carbon by definition has a light or a imaginary index of refraction that is dependent on wavelength. And so two important parameters are this imaginary index of refraction, so the amount of light that can be absorbed, and then the wavelength dependence, so how that depends on wavelength. And so what we found based on a bunch of filters from India and Malawi looking at stoves, this is showing the wavelength dependence on the x-axis, on the y-axis, and the log of the complex or the imaginary part of the index of refraction on the x-axis. So right is more absorbing. What we found is that, and this is comparing to some work of Rawad Saleh and others kind of summarizing a lot of work, is that these are pretty similar, consistent with what is called smoldering biomass combustion. And this is kind of distinct from what people have found in the lab with these same kinds of sources, where you have a much more absorbing and less wavelength dependent set of emissions. And so again, the kind of takeaway is that we had much higher OC emission factors in the field, which is going to have big impacts on maybe how you model emissions from this sector, but also that the OC tends to be less absorbing than what was observed in the field. I'm going to skip a little bit of a section here just because to keep on time, but very briefly, what we did is looked at the estimated forcing efficiency of these emissions, and we used a model developed by Tammy Pond and others that basically just relies on these optical properties and estimates how much the organic component is adding to the directive radiative forcing of black carbon. So that's what this ratio is showing. You can see, I'm gonna go through it very quickly, but you can see that at high, and this is showing it as a function of the EC to OA ratio. You can see at high EC to OA ratios, the OC is tending to enhance warming, and this is just based on transparent or clear OC coatings. If we add the brown carbon, you can see it is increasing the radiative effect of the overall aerosol, which makes sense, right? Because you have now this absorption And these lines are showing that additional amount. And we've compared this to what you observe in lab biomass studies. This is again from some other work by Rawad. And you can see that it is shifting where the sort of trade-off between OC enhancing warming and OC reducing warming occurs. So basically, these emissions look differently and have a different net climate effect as a function of EC to OA than lab-based biomass burning emissions. I'm going to skip this. So one thing that we did with this is we kind of parameterized this SFE. We used some reanalysis products looking at the column loading of aerosol to estimate what the effect of this brown carbon would be. And what this plot here is showing is the direct radiative effect of the whole aerosol, including the brown carbon. And so if we do the same estimate without the brown carbon, so with clear OC coating, what we can see is sort of the additional effect of accounting for the brown carbon. And these numbers aren't tiny, right? You're talking about tens of watts per meter squared, tenths of watt per meter squared over India. So all to say is that just adding this recognition of the absorption of OC and adding it in a way that sort of accurately represents these emissions has a relatively large effect of how we think about atmospheric warming over this subcontinent. All right, so shifting gears again, we've talked about the different components, and I think as everyone here knows, gas phase organics and particulate organics are a dynamic system that's linked. We think about secondary organic aerosol and primary organic aerosol as what is directly emitted and what's formed via oxidation. So what a couple of students working with me have done over a 5-year period or so was basically trying to assess how emissions from these different types of cook stoves evolve in the atmosphere. And so we did laboratory and some field, although I'm not going to talk about the field study, looking at emissions from these types of sources and how they evolve. And we used an oxidation flow reactor, which I'll briefly describe in case you're not familiar. So a couple of papers. I'm really going to mainly focus on the original results. And then we've also looked at things like changing fuel and changing how the oxidation flow reactor is operated to see how that influences our results. And then finally, Adi did a study where he took this whole mess into rural Mexico and ran it with sort of field-like studies, field-like conditions. And I'm not going to really talk about this, but I guess the takeaway there was it's hard to do in the field, as you might expect. All right, so what have we done in these studies is essentially taken emissions from different types of stoves or burning activity. And I should say a 3-stone fire is the most basic thing. That is literally a fire with 3 stones, that something you balance a pot on. So it's basically open burning. And so we build one of these in our labs. We take the emissions and sample them, and that's this primary emissions picture shows. And we also put them into a dark smog chamber, so a Teflon chamber. And once we have that population of emissions, we can then do experiments to look at how they evolve with aging. So we have this oxidation flow reactor, and we have a set of aerosol and gas phase instrumentation to look at what we're sampling. So the OFR that we use is one that we built, and it's what's called OFR 185. So it's using UV lights that include 185 nanometer UV. And we can essentially simulate days to weeks of equivalent atmospheric aging. And I put in quotes because there's definitely a lot of questions about how representative this aging is of what occurs in the atmosphere. So many caveats there, but I still think there are some insights we can gain. And one other thing I'll note is that we sampled through the OFR during testing as well. So we have kind of 2 different data sets: online, where we're sampling while the burning is happening, and then batch, where we basically are sampling out of this chamber. I'll be talking about the ACSM, which is a kind of baby aerosol mass spectrometer. looking at loading, and then we use decay of carbon monoxide in the reactor as a tracer for exposure. So first focusing on just primary emissions, these are three kind of sort of archetypes of the types of things that I studied in the field. And the main thing to point out, this is a plot showing the modified combustion efficiency of combustion, so kind of a measure of how complete combustion is, and then the emission factor of particulate matter. And you can see, as you expect, that as you go to more efficient stoves, the more efficient combustion, the PM emission factor is reduced. And this these black set of points for the open fires, kind of in the same ballpark as sort of open wildfire burning in terms of emission factor and MCE. The other thing to point out, this is just showing the overall sample emission factor, quite a large range of emission factor and also an increasing EC fraction as you go to the more efficient combustion. So these experiments, kind of a simple walkthrough. This is showing what we're measuring in the smog chamber, both through and not through the emission, through the OFR. So this is the green is the organic loading and the black is a black carbon proxy. And so you can see, what's in the chambers decaying away. And when we have the sample passing through the oxidation flow reactor, we see this large enhancement in concentration of organics, but not of black carbon. When we sample through the OFR with the bulbs off, you see it's basically just a tube. And then we have bypass samples so that we can kind of monitor what is in the chamber over time and look at enhancement kind of piecewise. You can calculate an enhancement, which is just the difference between the sort of bypass and the aged condition. And you can also, what I'll mainly be talking about is an enhancement ratio, where you basically take that enhancement and you normalize it by the initial POA concentration. So what we started with. And that basically just gives you an idea of how much SOA or how much additional aerosol mass you have. So this is a plot showing that. This is the OA enhancement ratio as a function of the OH exposure. So we ran different bulb conditions for all these different experiments. And so you can see if there was no enhancement, it would be at this line, this one line. And then each of these colors corresponds to a stove. And so the black is the 3-stone fire, and the red is the Chulika, and the blue is the forced draft stove. And what you see is that there's a clear trend in terms of combustion efficiency and the enhancement ratio. And this is normalized by the initial initial emission factor. So essentially, these more efficient stoves are also making less relative amounts of SOA in terms of absolute amounts. And this overall range is kind of consistent with what folks have observed in smog chamber experiments with other types of biomass burning. So the range is not particularly surprising, but the fact that we see this very consistent trend in this ratio is maybe also not surprising, but what was noteworthy. I guess the other thing to point out is that if you're familiar with these, you can see that there's a trend of increased enhancement with increased aging, presumably due to functionalization, and then at some point it starts to drop off after a few days of equivalent aging. So one question that comes up a lot with this, and we wanted to answer right away, is the fact that we're basically using a chamber as a holding cell affecting our results. So, and one study estimated that, there's going to be a loss of the vapors that are contributing to SOA. And so watching this over time would have this effect of reducing how much additional OA we observe. What we saw was that's not the case. So we basically scanned up and then scanned down in bulk conditions with the same population of emissions. And so what this is showing is that, 2 points that are half an hour apart and 2 points that are 2.5 hours apart, we're essentially seeing the same enhancement, which, suggests to us that there's not on this time scale, a loss of vapors that are substantially affecting this observation. as I mentioned before, we also looked at online aging and batch aging, so online during an experiment and batch. And so this is another indication. So this is not a perfect match, and we see a slightly higher enhancement in our online experiments, but there's a bunch of different corrections, loss corrections in the OFR and others that we apply. So to me, this is, and there's also questions of, say, partitioning affecting our observations. But so there's some difference, but it's not stark. So just overall, sort of summarizing what I saw before, you see the primary emissions, and then you see the sort of equivalent secondary organic aerosol emissions, a strong function of which stove, and also a function of days. And you can see, after a few days is when we typically saw peak enhancement. And so, again, thinking in terms of net atmospheric effect of these, this is an important thing to consider, especially when most of that burning is this category here on the left. Another couple interesting things to point out, we looked at the AMS spectra or the ACSM spectra of these emissions and see some interesting trends with aging and with combustion. So this is the fraction in MZ44, so an oxidized marker, and then MZ60, which is typically used as a marker for biomass burning emissions. And this is showing for all these different experiments, light is fresh, and then the darker is heavily aged. And so what you see is that both going, in all cases, you see an increase in F44 or becoming more oxidized. And you see that, for example, these Phillips emissions, the very high combustion efficiency, we don't see much of this F60 fraction, and we see kind of a small change in F44, so kind of minimal additional oxygenation. And then you see a pretty dramatic reduction in the F60 contribution as you age these emissions. So you can see that in some of these cases, for the less efficient combustion, we have a pretty high contribution from F60, but that sort of decays away pretty much to an asymptote. So that a lot of this fresh biomass marker is being decayed either via combustion, higher combustion efficiency, or oxidation. Putting this sort of all together, this is the Van Crevelen plot showing estimated oxygen to carbon ratio on the x-axis and hydrogen to carbon on the y-axis. And a lot going on here, but just to kind of to point out that the fresh emissions, there's a quite strong kind of gradient with increasing combustion efficiency in the composition of the fresh particles. And then the trajectory as they age is kind of in a consistent direction and kind of comparatively more modest than the difference as you kind of span the range of different combustion efficiencies. So one additional thing that we did was look at the influence of changing fuel and also changing how the reactor is operated. So things like the external OH reactivity and water mixing ratio can have a really big role in the chemistry in the OFR. So what we did is we took, and this is a second study, is we took the same population of emissions, so the same batch, and we ran them through the reactor in two different conditions. And that's what this is showing. So wet is we add water vapor and additional dilution, and at low and dry, we have a low relative humidity and a higher concentration. And the dark points here are showing the wet operation, and the lighter points are showing dry operation. You can see, so for the Phillips, for example, there's really no difference in what we observed. In the other cases, a key difference is that we had a higher range of OH exposure when we ran with higher water vapor concentrations, which isn't surprising. We saw a slightly higher SOA concentration, but still the difference between combustion conditions is quite prominent. We also define different wood species in the same devices and the same approach. So this is with oak, red oak, and this is with loblolly pine. And we see slightly lower SOA production in the pine tests, but pretty similar properties otherwise. All right, so the sort of overall, in terms of the sort of impact framework, I would say what this does show is that improving combustion is going to have sort of an outsized effect on ambient PM contribution, because you basically have this large sort of additional benefit due to the reduced secondary organic aerosol. As far as climate, it's really hard to say, possibly less, because you're basically mitigating more possibly cooling aerosols. But okay, final chapter is something that's really more ongoing, and that's sort of more related to what Jay and I are going to be talking more about. And that's efforts to try to really tie this a bit more together by looking more fundamentally at combustion properties. Same types of emissions, but looking at properties parametrically as a function of combustion. And this is work that I did started doing during a sabbatical and in Sweden during early 2020, which turned out to be not the best timing, and sort of interrupted this. And then the main postdoc who was working on it has moved on. So it's trucking along, but a little more slowly than planned. And the key people I need to acknowledge are Joaquin Pagels on the bottom here, who was my host and kind of runs the aerosol group at Lund University, and then Vili Momborg, who did most of the work on running the actual experiments. But then the nice thing is this is a collaboration with the fire engineering group there. And also Johannes at Stockholm is doing some more kind of mass spec work on their samples. But what we did is use something called a controlled atmosphere cone calorimeter. And this is a device that's used in fire science applications. And it's mainly used to understand how things catch on fire, what kind of heat release occurs. So things like flammability, heat release, to understand, materials behavior in fires. But what we did, and so kind of very briefly, it's a load cell that you put a sample on, and this is what the sample looks like. And then there's a IR heat element in this cone, and that's why it's called a cone calorimeter. And you essentially uncover the element and can very reproducibly burn materials. The special thing about this one is that this is in a controlled atmosphere, so the whole thing is in a cell that can be where you can control the atmosphere, both the flow rate and also the composition of gas. And then what we did is added a whole bunch of fancy aerosol instrumentation, so SP and things to look at black carbon and size distributions, and then collected a bunch of samples, which is what we'll hopefully continue to work on. So the idea here was to kind of parametrically change conditions about combustion to explore combustion and pyrolysis conditions. So you can see we could vary the heat flux from the cone, change the air, inlet air gas composition, so either air or pure nitrogen, and change the inlet gas flow, and also change the fuel moisture. So I'm not going to talk about all this, but just, the main categories we talked about are ventilated pyrolysis, which is nitrogen at kind of full flow at a range of heat rates, ventilated combustion, which is where you have well-ventilated air combustion, and then underventilated, which is basically the same thing, but at much lower airflow. So it's kind of air starved. We have 40 experiments, and I'm just going to kind of highlight a couple results. The key thing here is that this is very repeatable. So these plots here are showing the sample mass for repeat experiments for different heat loads. You can see, repeat experiments quite similar. If you've done anything with biomass burning, repeatability is not an easy thing to achieve. This is showing the heat release rate for these different experiments. So again, you see very different profiles depending on the heat flux, but between replicate experiments, it's quite consistent. And one of the things that we can do is basically break this up into stages. This first stage is a pyrolysis phase where you have release of volatiles from the wood. And then you have an ignition or combustion phase, which is kind of the big chunk of when heat is being released. And then you have a burnout phase where you have sort of smoldering combustion. And so we can look at these phases separately if we have real-time instrumentation, and we can look at how, compared between different ways of operating the cone and also within the different phases. So just one example, this is comparing ventilated and under-ventilated combustion with the same heat flux. So everything's the same except for, in one case, you're kind of starving it for air. And you can see the pyrolysis peak here of OA being released. And then with the ventilated combustion, you can see pretty minimal organic aerosol being released during the combustion phase, a growing amount of black carbon. And you see a totally different profile for the underventilated combustion. You see OA throughout. You see a very large AMS identified PAH peak. And also kind of black carbon throughout the entire. So basically you have a kind of like soot burner type of combustion occurring on a wood sample. And so we can look at yields because we have a very precise measure of mass consumption and also the aerosol concentrations. And you can see a very drastic difference between underventilated and ventilated combustion, especially in this combustion phase. As I noted, the pHs are kind of, through the roof for the air-starved combustion. And then the black carbon yields are also very distinct between the two operation types. We can also look at AMS mass spec, and they, as you might expect, look very different. So here you see these large hydrocarbon, presumably pH peaks that are not present in the well-ventilated combustion, but also within the aerosol spectra, it's very distinct. All right, so I have a lot of questions about how to think about these and interpret them, and so that's why I'm looking forward to talking more with Jay and others about ways to kind of examine these. It's a very rich data set, and we have most of the paper written, but there's a lot more to do with the data set. So I'm looking forward to talking more about that. So some of the questions are, kind of how we can map this onto other types of combustion, be it the residential wood stoves that I've talked about, or open burning, and how we can link these ensemble properties to things like single particle morphology, mixing state, and essentially linking these things up. So I just think there's a lot that can be extracted from this. All right, I probably ran over a little bit, but hopefully there's questions, and happy to discuss more. But yeah, I think the key takeaways, again, I think household biofuel combustion, it's not just a health thing. It's affecting the atmosphere. It's a source that I think maybe is a little bit underappreciated from that standpoint. And I guess something that I maybe alluded to but didn't talk about is I think I think of biomass combustion as a spectrum, and this is part of that spectrum. I don't think it's completely separate from the type of biomass burning that say people focused on large plumes and wildfires. I think basically fires contain multitudes, and this is part of that multitude. And then I guess another theme is what we can learn from field work versus what we can learn from lab work. And I think anyone working in the atmosphere knows they're both very important. And I just want to thank especially members of my group, but also collaborators at other places, and especially and also of course thank you for being here, and Jay again for inviting me.
Yes, thanks. So we have time for the questions. So as usual, we start from online folks. If you have any question, you can maybe raise your hand, or you can also unmute. Okay, who will go first? Any questions? Okay, then maybe the people in the.
You go first.
Thanks, Andy. At this
might be a really inconsequential question to ask, but you mentioned obviously there's a variety of factors that affect efficiency of combustion. I'm curious, given the data that you presented on how much of this is like cooking, how much of what's cooking, I guess, affects like the organic aerosol formation. I'm just imagining like a boiling pot of water injecting a huge amount of steam versus, I don't know, someone cooking up vegetables. Frankly, like you showed that it's a huge scale. So at first, when I kind of thought I would ask you about this, it seemed like it might be small, but I'm curious if you could comment on, again, that as maybe a contributing factor to what kinds of organic aerosol are formed, the extent to which it forms SOA, either qualitatively or quantitatively.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say first on the kind of net contribution question, I mean, it can be substantial. I would say just sort of in our field experience, we look for that by looking at, because we observe what people are cooking, and we didn't see it until we measured LPG stoves, because then they're clean enough that the contribution can become a lot more important. I think it's a very interesting question in terms of, because certainly we know frying that emits lots of oils, there's going to be interactions. So I think both in terms of the primary emission properties and mixing, and then also evolution, I think that's, I don't think it's trivial. The effect of the water, I don't expect that to be huge because there's a lot of high temperature water vapor in the emissions already, but it could be depending on the circumstance. There's definitely aqueous chemistry that happens with these things, and I didn't touch on, I mean, I haven't done anything with that, but other folks have. So in the sort of atmospheric evolutions, I think that would be important. I don't know if I answered the question.
No, I mean, you did. I think it kind of highlights this. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but it's big enough to matter still.
Yeah, and obviously, I mean, there's been a lot of work looking at source apportionment in U.S. cities or more developed settings, and cooking aerosol really pops out, right? So it's not to say that it's not contributing. It's just that when you do have people basically with campfires everywhere on a, country or continent level scale, it might swamp that a little bit.
Great talk. I was just curious if there were any similarities or differences between, like, you had a lot of field work regionally, and were there any differences in, I guess, for example, like a more resource poor region versus a better, higher resource rich region?
Yeah, there's a lot of differences. That's a good question. And should I repeat questions, or can people hear?
There's mics.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different, for one, for example, urban versus rural. If you go to these resource constrained settings, most urban settings, the sort of energy ladder is from using wood to using charcoal, and the emissions from charcoal and wood are very different. So that's one, and that happens anywhere there's sort of a rural to urban transition, because people can't harvest their own wood, or the supply chain is very different. I think between settings, things like everything is different, cooking practice and cuisine, and in terms of these interventions, there are things like access to electricity might be required for some of these forced draft stoves, and that can really affect how well they get accepted. It's very, very context specific, I guess. I think I will say that, if we look at open burning in terms of things like emissions and properties, it's variable, but and there's a lot of variability within a country and then also across regions. But I'd say the overall kind of range of variability is similar. And then there are certain things that will kind of shift the distribution one way or the other. Things like we've seen fuel moisture levels is a really big one, which if you've ever tried to start a fire with wet wood is not. But even minor changes in fuel moisture can lead to differences. So that's something that can vary regionally or seasonally.
Thanks.
I see Rahul has a question.
Hey, really nice talk, Andy. I had a quick question on the size distributions of these aerosols that are emitted from stoves. So do you measure size distributions routinely, and how do they, if you do, how do they differ from stove to stove and like from fuel to fuel?
We've relatively routinely measured them. We've not done it much in the field just because, it's a lot more wieldy to bring something like an SMPS or something into these field settings. There's a pretty substantial difference between the forced draft stoves and the normal sort of open burning. I would say the three-stone fire type emissions are kind of similar to what you would expect for fresh open burning emissions. So, volume, median diameters in the sort of 100-ish nanometer range. And then when you go to the gasifiers, it's much smaller. So, 30 nanometer sort of number modes. So yeah, it varies quite substantially between technologies. I actually haven't looked at charcoal, but charcoal I would expect to be quite small based on the combustion mode. I don't know, did I get your question or?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could comment on the differences between the lab and the field findings, and maybe what you think are the sources for those differences.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of different things, and we've spent some time trying to sort of recreate field conditions in the lab. So I think this isn't maybe surprising, but the more controlled of a system, the more engineered of a combustion system, that variability gets a bit smaller. But I will say, for example, the gasifier stoves that we've studied. So, for example, the pellet-driven gasifiers, you have a very homogenized fuel and you have an engineered combustor. Typically, the variance is quite small, except that people will overfill them or they'll refuel them in an inappropriate way. And then that's when you can get this sort of smoke bomb kind of, but that's sort of it's sort of, I don't know if vehicles, there's the sort of long tail of super emitters. We see that with those kind of stoves. With the open burning, some of it's a lot of it's due to the testing protocols that are used. It's a very kind of prescribed, boil some water, simmer it for a while, put it out. And in reality, the activity that people are going is a lot more complicated, right? Like you start a fire and then your kid runs in and you chase them and then the fire goes out and then you have to stoke it back up. So a lot of us, the lab protocols are made for repeatability and sort of simplicity rather than representativeness.
Well, the reason I bring it up, a lot of modelers who kind of base, yields or parameterizations, often we'll look at the literature and you'll look at, oh, here's a laboratory result.
Yeah.
Let's stick it in a model.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not, maybe if there's a field result that's comparable, maybe that's a more, appropriate thing to do. It's just one of those things one has to think about in terms of uncertainty, in terms of model predictions.
Yeah.
Where they're getting their data from to base these relationships from.
Yeah. Inventory developers, I think, are very interested in these kind of things because it is definitely a lot more representative. But hasn't been that much of it done. So, yeah.
Kind of a technical question.
Yeah.
When you're out in the field and you're sampling these fires, are you using online instrumentation or are you like sampling and then bringing them back to the lab?
It's a mix. It's not, and I would say instrumentation, it's more a combination of sensors and sample collection. Let's see if I can find a reasonable sampling system. So it's, this is a microethylometer, and then there's some gas sensors and a PM light scattering sensor, and then we collect filters with the combination. Because basically getting to these places, we don't do freight, because if you put yourself at the mercy of customs, you'll never get anything done. So these are carry-on luggage, which leads to some, fun discussions at airports.
Sure.
And they're battery powered, because most of the places don't have access to grid electricity. And it shrunk over time. This is the earlier version, and then it's gotten down to something carry-on size. Yeah, and then, the most extensive thing we did was taking the OFR to Mexico, and that was, again, what we did with OFR was all filter and sort of small sensor based. And I think one of the interesting things about that was that we had kind of similar overall observations, and we have those filters, but we don't have any of the we didn't have control over the aging process, over dilution, things like that. And it made running those difficult, but similar overall conclusions in terms of what we observed from SOE production and stuff.